They were told they'd never make it. A Mexican-American and a Canadian-Chinese stoner duo. No studio wanted them. No network believed in them. But they went on to sell over 30 million comedy albums, build a cult empire, and change American counterculture forever. What most people don't know is the darker truth hiding behind the laughs, the betrayal, the broken friendship, and the secret that nearly ended everything. Stay with this until the end. The real story is nothing like the legend. It was 1969. America was loud, fractured, and burning at the edges. The Vietnam War was consuming a generation. Cities were splitting along lines of race and class. And somewhere in the middle of all that noise, two men who had no business meeting each other did. Richard Marin grew up in South Los Angeles. His father was a police officer with the LAPD. That single fact would later carry a quiet irony that almost felt scripted, because Richard would spend the next 2 decades playing characters who ran from exactly that kind of authority. On the street, kids called him Cheech, a nickname pulled from a Mexican snack called chicharron. He was working class, sharp, and already carrying the weight of a community that mainstream America treated like a footnote. Tommy Chong's story began further north and ran stranger. Born in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, to a Chinese father and a Scots-Irish mother, Chong grew up between identities, never fully claimed by any single culture, always existing slightly outside the frame. Before comedy, he had already lived what felt like 3 separate lives. He played guitar in rhythm and blues bands across Western Canada. He co-owned a strip club in Vancouver. He ran an improv comedy room and filled it with people willing to take risks on stage that nobody else would take. When Cheech walked into that Vancouver club looking for work, neither man was looking for a partner. But within weeks, something was happening on that stage that couldn't be faked or manufactured. Their chemistry was instinctive, the kind that either exists from the first moment or never develops at all. What made it work went deeper than the material. Cheech carried the authentic voice of the Chicano experience, the frustration, the dark humor, the dignity that survives when a community is constantly told it doesn't matter. Chong brought something different, the perspective of a man who had never fully belonged anywhere, which meant he could observe everything with a clarity that insiders rarely have. Together, they built something that millions of people, especially those on the margins, had never seen reflected back at them. But even then, in those early Vancouver nights, a quiet question was forming beneath the surface. One that wouldn't be asked out loud for years. Who was really driving this act? And what would happen when both men finally wanted the answer at the same time? 6:37 p.m. The clubs got louder. The crowds got bigger. And word started spreading in the way it only does when something is genuinely different, not through marketing, not through industry buzz, but through people telling other people that they had to see this for themselves. By 1971, Cheech and Chong had built enough of a following that they were ready to record. The problem was that nobody in the music industry wanted to touch them. Major labels passed. Executives listened to the material and shook their heads. One reportedly described the act as having zero commercial appeal. Another suggested the content was too risky, too ethnic, too far outside the boundaries of what mainstream audiences would accept. What those executives were really saying, though none of them would have framed it this way, was that they didn't believe an audience built around the Chicano experience, the counterculture, and the lived reality of people who existed outside the American mainstream was worth investing in. It was a miscalculation of historic proportions. Lou Adler, the producer behind some of the most important music of the 1960s, ran a small independent label called Ode Records. He saw what the major labels had missed. In 1971, Ode released the debut self-titled album Cheech and Chong. There was no massive promotional push, no radio saturation, no late-night television appearances. The album spread the way underground things spread, organically, person to person, passed between friends like something contraband and precious. It went gold. The industry that had dismissed them was now watching. But Cheech and Chong weren't waiting for anyone's approval. They were already working on what came next. In 1973, their album Los Cochinos won the Grammy Award for Best Comedy Recording. Read that again slowly. a Mexican-American and a half-Chinese Canadian, making material that every major label had called uncommercial, stood at the top of their industry's most recognized award stage. It was the kind of moment that doesn't just feel good, it redraws the map. And if you've ever felt like the people in charge couldn't see what you were actually capable of, drop something in the comments. Because this story is really about that more than anything else. What most casual fans never understood was how much craft was buried inside those albums. The surface looked loose and spontaneous, two guys rambling, laughing, getting lost in their own bits. But underneath that, the architecture was deliberate. The timing was precise. The cultural references were layered in ways that rewarded close listening. Cheech handled the street-level authenticity, the voice, the accent, the raw human texture of the characters. Chong shaped the structure, the beats, the builds, the moments where chaos was allowed to land. It was a creative division of labor that functioned almost perfectly. Cheech was the soul. Chong was the skeleton. Together, they moved. Between 1971 and 1985, they released 8 studio comedy albums. Each one found its audience faster than the last. They weren't just making people laugh. They were making people feel seen. The Vietnam War had left a generation hollowed out and mistrustful of authority. Nixon's presidency had confirmed every suspicion young Americans had about the people running the country. And there were Cheech and Chong, two men who looked nothing like the faces on television, telling those young Americans that their world, their language, their reality was worth putting on record. The albums weren't just comedy. They were cultural artifacts. Historians studying the American counterculture of the 1970s would later return to this material not just for entertainment value, but for what it revealed about who was actually living through that era and how they were surviving it. But behind the recording booth, something was shifting. Quietly, almost imperceptibly at first. Two men who had built something extraordinary together were beginning to want different things from it. The creative partnership that had produced gold records and Grammy Awards was carrying a tension that studio laughter couldn't quite cover. And that tension had a name. It just hadn't been spoken out loud yet. When Up in Smoke arrived in theaters in September 1978, Hollywood treated it like a minor release. Paramount gave it a limited promotional budget, a cautious distribution plan, and the kind of quiet rollout that studios reserve for projects they've already mentally written off. Internally, there were executives who debated pulling it from theaters after the opening weekend if numbers came in soft. The numbers did not come in soft. Up in Smoke earned approximately $28 million domestically against a production budget of roughly $2 million. For context, that is a return ratio that most studio films never come close to achieving. Adjusted for inflation, it remains one of the most profitable comedy films ever made. Hollywood had a problem. It had underestimated an audience it didn't understand, built around two performers it had never taken seriously, making a film that broke nearly every unwritten rule about what mainstream cinema was supposed to look like. What followed was a string of films that kept audiences returning. Cheech and Chong's next movie, Nice Dreams, Still Smokin', each one met with critical indifference and popular devotion in almost equal measure. The disconnect between what reviewers wrote and what audiences did was striking. Critics couldn't categorize them. The work didn't fit neatly into any box that the entertainment press had prepared. But behind the cameras, the distance between Cheech and Chong was growing. Chong was directing. Cheech was restless. Small creative disagreements that had once dissolved into laughter were beginning to settle into something harder. The chemistry that had looked effortless on screen was requiring more effort off-screen than either man was letting on. There was one project quietly developing that would force everything into the open, and neither of them was ready for what came next. 6:38 p.m. By 1985, it was done. Cheech Marin walked away from the partnership without a dramatic public announcement, without a headline-grabbing confrontation, without the kind of explosive ending that the entertainment press could easily package and sell. He simply left. And in some ways, that quiet exit made it harder to process, for fans, for the industry, and almost certainly for Tommy Chong. The reasons, as both men have discussed in separate interviews over the years, were never simple. Cheech felt the walls closing in. The characters they had built together, beloved as they were, had become a ceiling rather than a stage. He wanted to act. He wanted to be taken seriously in rooms where the Cheech and Chong brand was more of a punchline than a credential. He had watched his own talents get absorbed into an archetype, and he was no longer willing to let that continue. Chong saw it differently. In his telling, the act still had real creative life left in it. The audiences were still there. The chemistry was still real. What Cheech was calling a ceiling, Chong experienced as a foundation worth building on. Both men were right. That was the tragedy of it. Their solo paths diverged sharply. Cheech wrote and directed Born in East LA in 1987, a film that carried genuine cultural weight, telling the story of a Mexican-American man deported to a country he had never lived in. It was funny and painful in equal measure, and it proved exactly what Cheech had been trying to prove. Chong's solo projects found less traction. And then in 2003, something happened that reframed his entire story in ways nobody had anticipated. The government came knocking. And this time, there was nothing funny about it. Operation Pipe Dreams sounds like something Cheech and Chong might have written themselves. The name alone carries an absurdist quality that would have fit perfectly into one of their albums. But what it represented was entirely serious. And for Tommy Chong, it would become the most defining and painful chapter of his life. In 2003, the United States Department of Justice launched a federal crackdown targeting businesses that sold drug paraphernalia. The operation swept across multiple states, identified dozens of companies, and made several arrests. Among those targeted was Chong Glass, a family business run by Tommy Chong's son, selling hand-blown glass pipes online. Tommy Chong had not been the operational force behind the company. He had lent his name to it. That was enough. Federal prosecutors pursued him specifically and aggressively. Of all the individuals caught up in Operation Pipe Dreams, Tommy Chong was the only one who served prison time. 9 months in federal custody at a minimum security facility in California. He was 65 years old. The selective nature of that prosecution drew significant attention from civil liberties advocates and legal commentators at the time. The question being raised carefully and consistently was whether Tommy Chong the businessman had been prosecuted or whether Tommy Chong the cultural symbol had been made an example of. Whether decades of comedy built around drug culture had painted a target on his back that a glass pipe company simply made easier to hit. Chong served his sentence. He spoke about the experience with a composure that was either hard-earned wisdom or careful performance, perhaps both. But the deeper question lingered long after his release. Had the characters they created together, the ones that made millions laugh, quietly contributed to the world that put one of their creators behind bars? That question had no clean answer. It still doesn't.